today, giving a similar talk, which I'll get into. But first, I wanted to kind of give you a little bit of an overview of my company. Automated Insights is a VC-backed startup based in Durham, North Carolina. At a sort of fundamental level, what we do is transform data into different types of content that can range anywhere from stories and visualizations to tweets and emails. And in fact, it might be kind of interesting to know that we're actually the largest producer of high-quality content in the world. I can say that because all of our content is completely automated, and we generate upwards of several million pieces of content, again, ranging from tweets, emails, and full-length stories every single week. The largest sports media companies in the world can only do in the thousands, maybe tens of thousands a week. We do in the millions every single week. So again, to simplify what we do, we take structured data and turn it into content. So we'll take a box score from a baseball game and turn it into a recap of the game. We can take MLS data and turn it into neighborhood real estate reports. We can take financial market data and turn that into earnings previews, recaps, etc. So if we have structured data, we can tell stories from that. Again, I was here last year, and the title of my talk was Automating Bill Simmons. And I talked a little bit about some of the things that we've done in the sports space. And the punchline was that we're not actually automating Bill Simmons, at least not yet, but we are automating lots of different types of sports journalism, primarily in the quantitative realm. So, all of our analysis today is quantitatively based. We need numbers. We can tell stories of those numbers. It's not qualitatively based, which is, drawing on experiences, incorporating the senses and other aspects that are uniquely human. One of the interesting aspects of what we do is I think that the technology is evolving fast enough that within 5 to 10 years, you won't have people doing quantitative data analysis. Computers and specifically software is so much better attuned at doing number crunching, data analysis, that in 5 years we'll look back and think it was funny that we actually had people sitting at computers trying to do that manually. Again, just a little bit about the Statsheet network, which is some of the work that we've done on the sports side. We have over 400 websites. We take a team-centric approach to generating content. We generate recaps and previews and a variety of stories at a team level. So for any one game, we'll generate 2 recaps, one for the winning team and one for the losing team. We've also created a host of mobile apps, over 400 on the Android platform and about a dozen on the iOS platform. And again, those are very team-centric. You can go and download your favorite team's mobile app that includes all the content that we create, as well as a lot of statistical analysis. So one of the questions that I often get is, I can get that maybe you can produce a recap of a game given a box score, but is that the extent of how far it can go? And in fact, what we've been able to do in a fairly short period of time is automate over 20 different types of articles in the sports space. And we have a laundry list of another 30 that we could do. But for example, we can do things like season previews, where we analyze the returning players on a team, any changes in a team, what's the schedule like, take into account any preseason rankings, and deliver a fairly meaty analysis of what a team is expected to do for the year. We do obviously recaps and previews, game notes, which are essentially interesting factoids that I'll talk more about in a minute. We can do top 25 analysis every week when the new polls come out. We've automated bracketology, so beginning the first week of January, we produce what we call Stat Seed, which is not just estimating what's going to be the NCAA tournament seeding, but we do it for all the postseason college basketball tournaments. We do on this day historical retrospectives, which, for example, in a sport like Major League Baseball, where we have over 120 years worth of data, we can do some really cool, analysis and summaries about, Lou Gehrig having a 3 home run game, for example. We've automated trivia, so we can generate over 1,000 questions for every team and also for players. Historically, that's very difficult for media companies to produce and keep fresh. It's something that we can automate just like we can a story. We've automated the art of smack talking through our StatSmack app, where you can pick any two teams in essentially any sport that we cover, and we'll give you 5 to 20 statistical slams that you can use to show your friends why your team is better than theirs. And it just goes on and on. I mean, another interesting one, a lot of those are the type of stories that you might see today from, the traditional outlets. There's also others that we do that I don't think anybody else touches. For example, we have probably the most in-depth database when it comes to college basketball referees and the fouls they call, et cetera. And so one of the articles that we've started to develop is called Referees to Root For or Against. And essentially what we can do is for every team, take a look at which referees have called X number of games for that team, determine does the team tend to win more or less when that referee calls their game, does that referee call more or fewer fouls than their average per game, and that obviously engenders quite a lot of interesting discussion. Okay, so again, a lot of that is in the realm of what you see people doing today, whether it's before a game or after a game. We took a step back and thought, well, where does it make sense for software? Where does software really shine? And one of the aspects that's great about software is it's kind of time independent. It can generate content as soon as it gets the data. Even with the kind of processing that we do, it may only take 30 seconds to a minute to be able to create a piece of content. And so we thought, well, one of the areas that's very difficult for humans to create content is real time during games. A play happens, and then within 20 seconds, come up with all the interesting things, statistically speaking, that happened with that play. That's just very difficult to do. But again, it's perfect for software. And so a couple weeks ago at the On Deck conference in New York City, a new sports technology conference hosted by SeatGeek, which is an innovative ticketing company, shout out to them. We launched a real-time insights platform, and our first example of that was real-time insights for Major League Baseball. And so just to give you an idea of what we produce out of that, let's take this play, Adam Dunn homered to left center. From that, within 30 seconds, we can compute things like, that was an MLB leading 35th home run for the year. Adam Dunn moves into sole possession of 50th place all-time for home runs in Major League Baseball. We can even say things like when there's 2 or more home runs in a game, the White Sox are 34-10. And so that gives you an idea. And the color coding represents, we also classify each of these because, the idea is we'll be able to generate over time, potentially 20 different things per play that happened. But you may not want to have 20 things surface to end users. And in fact, this is a feed that we provide to sports media companies. And so what we did was score each of them so that a company can take into account, all right, I only want the highest impact insights, or maybe, given my use case, I want all of them. So just give me the fire hose feed of insights that you're able to generate for every play. We allow that kind of flexibility. And so anybody can play around with this. We created a demo at realtime.automatedinsights.com, so you can go there and there's a host of games from last year that you can kind of run through and see the types of insights we create. But anyway, we're pretty happy with the response so far on that. All right, so that kind of gets you up to speed, briefly on what we've been up to as a company since the last year. This year, I was thinking, all right, last year we were automating Bill Simmons. This year, why don't we take a stab at automating Matthew Berry? And again, much like what I was talking about with Bill Simmons, we're not actually going to automate Matthew Berry. I mean, there's certain things that he does that, again, are not great fits for software-generated content, but there's a lot of stuff in the fantasy space specifically that is very well suited to automation. And so just want to step back for a second and kind of share my vision for the future of content. Historically, you have more of a one-size-fits-all model when it comes to content creation. You have an expert like a Matthew Berry or a Bill Simmons create a piece of content, and the goal for that content is to be read by as many people as possible. You're going to create it, and therefore you're going to have to genericize it to some degree so that it is attractive to a large audience. In the last 5 to 10 years, there's been a move to local content. That's become a buzzword in the content space. And really what they mean by that is taking a more targeted view on content. Maybe it's at a specific demographic or geographic level, and you're going to create a content that is still ultimately has the same model, but you may just create more of it so that you can spread it around a lot of different geographies. Our model, which is now only possible because of automation, is personalized content. And what I mean by personalized content is different than what you may have traditionally heard of personalized content. And that's often done in the realm of personalized search. So if somebody's talking about personalized content, what they mean is, we're going to monitor your search behavior, your website usage patterns, and we know that you've been visiting a lot of Cisco-related content, so when Cisco's earning preview comes up, we're going to surface that to you automatically. That's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is creating a piece of content for an audience of one, where we create a piece of content that only is read by one person. And in fact, most of our use cases these days that we focus on as a company is places where we don't charge by volume. In fact, we want our clients to want to create as much content as possible, because when we can create a piece of content that's read by only one person, then we can personalize it to a level that's going to really resonate with that person. So the first big example of this, and this was kind of a hypothesis we had last year, we thought that if we had access to personal information on people and were able to automate content for them, that they would like that. But we didn't really have sort of a platform to test that out on until we started to get into fantasy content. And that's kind of the purpose of the talk today. We're inside of Automated Insights, we're fantasy fanatics, we play most of the major fantasy sports. And we thought that this notion of creating recaps after games or previews before games, that same thing could be applied to fantasy sports. And in fact, it could be even more interesting because there's nobody generating content in that capacity today, unlike the traditional sports. And so what we did for this past season was create fantasy recaps, previews, and various forms of SMAC, and publish that on some of the largest fantasy platforms today. Yahoo was one of our partners. And so every week we would generate on Tuesday morning, millions of recaps for every single matchup that week. Now, that presented some problems initially. There's a scale component to that. Again, as I mentioned before, ideally for us, we want to generate as much content as you could possibly envision your users wanting. Well, when you're dealing with fantasy and there's literally millions of teams every week playing against each other, therefore there's going to be millions of recaps that we have to generate. And how can we possibly generate millions of recaps, especially in a fantasy context where Tuesday is the primary focal point for analyzing how your team did that week? By the time it gets to Wednesday, you're looking on to the next day. So for us, we had to be able to generate the recaps as quickly as possible Tuesday morning. All of our stuff is based in the cloud. So we're a big AWS shop, and we were able to create a solution that enabled us to go all the way. Initially, I was estimating it might take 12 hours to generate, several million pieces of content. We got that process down to under an hour. And we were able to do that by spinning up over 300 servers at a time to process all of that content and do all the number crunching that we needed. And in fact, I think we could probably get it down even more than that. Now, 5 to 10 years ago, I couldn't have done this. As a VC-backed startup, there's no way I could have afforded to launch or have that kind of computational infrastructure. Now with Amazon, we can fire it up, and 2 hours later, we take it all down, and we're not charged for it after it's taken down. So fortunately, the cloud is really, we're at the right time at the right place when it comes to being able to do personalization at this scale. Okay, so I just want to go through a few examples of the type of fantasy content I'm talking about that'll be coming to a league near you soon. This is an example of one that we did for Yahoo. We started with an opening paragraph which kind of puts the matchup in perspective. Were there any records set related to that matchup within that specific league? What's the playoff context? Are the teams fighting? This was actually an example of, my team was CWO, and you can see I lost. This was in the consolation bracket, so not very proud of this one, but I did play in multiple leagues, and because I was in enough leagues, I had one league that I actually did really well in. So I found if you play in enough of them, you'll eventually have a successful team. You'll notice the next section, smooth moves, that's for the winning team. What are the cool things that the winning team did, the good moves? Regret tracker, or what are all the mistakes or the potentially negative things that the losing team did. Going to the next slide shows just sort of general game notes. Again, we take just basic information like projected and actual points for all the players, and we can compute things like, knowing that Des Bryant led the league in scoring that week and had the highest receiver score in the league this season for my team that week. We know that the margin of victory, and this was a particularly painful recap because, if I think it was in the had the highest combined scoring output for the receiver position, and it was one of the highest scoring outputs of the season for a team, and I had one of the smallest margins of victory against me, 2.5 points, in the league that season. So we actually come up with different algorithms to detect what are storylines that we could potentially talk about. This is one that we call a tough win. Because in this case, it was a high scoring output and a low margin of victory. Therefore, there's a lot of luck involved. It could have gone either way very easily. Even a stat correction could change the outcome of this matchup. And so the storyline that we'll talk about will kind of play that up. We have other ones like come from behind victory. You're going into Monday night and you're losing, but then you have a great performance and then you win. We'll talk about that being a come from behind victory. So there's lots of different storylines that we're able to bake into this. And even though we generated over 50 million recaps last season, we got zero negative feedback about it being repetitive, about it sounding automated, just lots of positive feedback overall. All right, this next one is a preview, and again, it's very similar in that we can put the matchup in a playoff perspective. We can talk about potential moves that either team should consider making. Who are the key players in the matchup, and depending on how they perform will dictate the outcome of the matchup. We can include things like what's the team's average, highest, lowest score. And ultimately what we intend to do for that is also make it more predictive. So estimating, here are some potential trades you may want to make to help your team this week overcome some of the deficits that we've determined will make you not win the game, but you can maybe improve some aspect of your team by doing this trade, and you'll have a better chance of winning. This is an example of the smack talk I was referring to earlier. It's kind of funny. We started getting a lot of feedback on the recaps, and they're not necessarily nice to the losing team. In fact, they, as I'll show in a minute, a lot of people kind of got emotional about the recaps when they lost. But we also got a lot of feedback from people saying, I wish it was even more snarky. Is there any way you can make it so that you can just rip my opponent apart? And so that was just like what we've done with StatSmack, which is, again, we apply that to the traditional sports. So we developed something like that for fantasy, where you can, again, select any two teams, and we'll present, in this case, we can do, literally 30 to 40 different statistical slams that you as a fantasy manager can say about any other fantasy manager in your league. Okay, so what did we learn? Again, going into this, we didn't really know. It was a little bit of faith on, how would users react to this. And what we found out was from the moment the recap started to become available, they were being consumed. And that was one of the reasons we wanted to shrink the timeline it took to actually generate the recaps. We found if the first recap became available at 6 a.m. on Tuesday morning, the first recap was viewed at 6 a.m. And there was no notification to the users. It was just they were browsing around the site and they saw it, or they were waiting for it, and they started looking at it. And so we wanted to quickly move the time frame back as much as possible. But every week we saw usage grow and grow. There was concerns, all right, yeah, I can understand this will be interesting initially, but I think it's going to die down over a period of weeks. Again, the fantasy season was 17 weeks. And we saw usage continue to grow every single week. There was no drop-off until I think it was week 15 when the playoffs started. Obviously, there were fewer teams playing at that point, so there weren't as many people that had recaps. But even in the later weeks where you traditionally find people falling off fantasy usage because they know they're just out of it, there's no chance of them making the playoffs, we still saw usage increase week over week. And in fact, the other interesting thing we found was, despite there being there were no links on sharing, there was nothing to indicate to the users to share this, they started going to Twitter, Facebook, and even Reddit talking about these great recaps. Somebody wanted to nominate us for the Nobel Prize, and I think that's a great idea. A lot of people talking about, hey, this is cool that I have a reporter covering my event, just like a traditional game. And so we got this week over week where people would just go to Twitter. And in fact, it was probably, again, getting back to the smack talk, one of the biggest use cases we found was whenever the recaps come out, somebody sharing it with their friend, but it was the friend that they were playing, kind of using it to rub it in their face that they won. I have to admit, I also participated in this. I have a couple of recaps I printed out and hung up in my office so that when some of the guys come into my office, I can remind them of when we played last season. So it's great even just for a historical perspective. The other thing that was a little interesting was how emotional people got about these recaps. I mean, people would talk about it, making them feel good and making them feel emotional, or, kind of on the flip side of that, we had a person email us and said, something to the effect of, I know my team's not very good. This is the first time I've ever played fantasy football. Why do you have to continue to tell me my team is not any good every single week? And we're like, hey, it's just the software speak, and we didn't actually write that specifically about you. It's nothing personal. It's just something that, your team's not very good. And so the software kind of unemotionally tells the story, right? But it's funny, the reaction every week. We'd get tweets where people would say, uh-oh, I lost this week. I can't wait to see how my recap rips me this week, And so there was a lot of that. It was completely unexpected. We didn't go in trying to make it like it was ripping anybody. We just had like one section that talked about maybe the negative things that the losing team did, and people really, didn't really take offense to it, but they really got emotional and took it to heart. All right, another thing, as we have access to so much fantasy data, there's, interesting analysis we could do, not just for a specific league, but across all the leagues. And so one of the things that fantasy teams are famous for are coming up with their clever names, right? There's all sorts of interesting names. I'm sure if you played fantasy, you've seen people that you play with have their clever names. What we found is there are no clever names. Everybody pretty much uses the same set of names. There are some unique names out there, but it's pretty funny just to even look at the top 5 most used names. Prestige Worldwide was in the top 5 of most popular fantasy names. I hate to say it, but Show Me Your TDs was one of the top 5 fantasy team names, and TDs was a common theme throughout the most popular team names. Victoria's Secret, that one was it's a clever one, sure, but it was also in the top 5 most common, meaning thousands of people use those team names. And so we even ran internally, we had a test. All right, so before we kind of knew that we were going to do this, we ran a test to see did anybody in our company actually have a unique team name. And it turned out no, even though we thought, some of the guys thought they had some really cool names that they came up with that were clever spins off of something, somebody else actually had that or something very close to it. So anyway, that was just kind of an interesting tidbit that we found. All right, so what's possible? As you'll notice, this list is pretty similar to the list that I had up before of the types of content we're creating for traditional sports today. Everything from recaps and previews, and that could be at the matchup level, it could be at the league level, smack talk, which I spent some time talking about, trivia, which is an area that we're starting to explore where we can create automated questions about a specific league and, who are the leaders in the league, who's had the highest running back total. There's all sorts of interesting things we can do just for a league itself and automating questions to see who really is the most knowledgeable in a specific fantasy league. Draft and season summaries, we can do some automated analysis there. And then lastly, real time. And again, I think this is a natural evolution for where I see the space going, much like we did in the traditional sports space, where we combine the two. We'll take our real-time insights platform for sports and marry that with live fantasy data so that we can produce something like the following. Ray Rice rushes for 5 yards for a touchdown. There we can identify that Ray Rice has eight touchdowns in his career against the Bengals, which is the second highest among active running backs, as well as a host of others, kind of like I showed before with the Adam Dunn example. But then we can also provide specific fantasy insights. CWO, which is my team, is 5-1 when Ray Rice scores at least one touchdown in a game. We can talk about how if Ray Rice scores another touchdown, CWO's odds of winning increase to 78%. So imagine kind of within a Gamecast or stat tracker, not only are you tracking the stats and you're seeing the play-by-play Ray Rice rush for 5 yards, but now you're getting all this additional insight and content related to your fantasy team or fantasy teams. We think that will be sort of the next evolution of where we go in fantasy. Okay, so one final thing I just wanted to leave you with. Again, this is a little bit out there, but I kind of like to throw out different ideas from time to time. If you think about it, I as an NBA fantasy user rarely watch NBA games. So I'm a big college basketball fan. I don't watch much NBA. I've probably seen a half of an NBA game this year. But I play in an NBA fantasy league. My whole understanding of what's going on with the NBA is within the NBA fantasy platform that we're using. All the stats, the player notes, the injury reports, all of that is tied up into the platform. So, to me, does the NBA even really exist outside of that? And so if we can automate all the stats analysis, if we can simulate games for a whole season, if we can even create lifelike imitations of players a la Madden and some of the other games, and if we can automate the fantasy recaps and previews and all the reporting that goes around it, why not automate the whole thing? Imagine for a second if your NFL fantasy drafts was the same week as your MLB fantasy draft, or you had a March Madness bracket contest in July. Or you maybe don't like that the MLB season's 162 games, and so you could create an MLB fantasy league where you're only playing an 81-game season. And sort of in conclusion, imagine if you and your friends could create a fantasy league for any sport at any point during the year with any configuration of team, players, and games. And so again, not to say that this will necessarily replace what happens or that you will necessarily prefer a virtual game to the live thing, but if you think about it, most video games are not tied to a specific season or time period, and they're very popular throughout a year. Fantasy's tied to a specific season, and so imagine the day after the Super Bowl, the NFL creates a new league that's completely virtual. Maybe it's even based on the same players if it's through the league. That enables it to have a whole virtual season from the time of the end of the Super Bowl until August. And they could simulate stats, injuries, and all of that so that you could essentially have a second season and play NFL fantasy year-round. And again, I think you can go as far as even saying, you and your friends configuring an NFL fan or a football or a baseball fantasy league so that you can say, all right, I want to start in November. I want there to be this many games. I want to see the games on Saturday. Configure it. And so maybe next year when I come back and talk, I'll talk more about how we're trying to automate LeBron James and Tom Brady. Again, that's probably further down the road than where we're at today, but I still think there's something there. We're doing all this automation around analysis, statistical reporting. We're not too far away from being able to envision a situation where we could just automate the whole thing and all the possibilities that opens up. All right, happy to answer any questions.
Here you go, I've got a mic.
Do you have a way you can search those team names? Because I had one that was, I don't want to say it was a little off color, but I think I'm the only one and it was good.
Yeah, we can search them, and so happy to do that for you. And just so you know, some of our guys this year started putting Roman numerals in their team names just so they will make sure they're unique. I think that's cheating, but that's fine.
Probably a question you've gotten before from the media professionals, the writers, and stuff like that. How is your staff kind of put together to make sure the language is right, that it is authentic, that it doesn't sound like a computer is putting it together? Because it's really nice. It looks very good.
Thanks. And so one of the nice things about automated content is it's time independent. And so typically what that means for our clients is if we can get some amount of historical data, we can generate literally thousands, if not millions examples before we ever even go live. And so what we did for this past fantasy football season is we got the previous year's fantasy data, and we generated all 50 million recaps for the previous year so that both us and our clients have ample opportunity to read through as many examples as possible. So by the time the season starts up, there's no question about what's going to come out and how is it going to read. Everybody's seen it and read as many as they possibly could handle.
Hi, so my question is, if you're working with Yahoo Sports, how do you but you're working with another company that wants to sort of integrate a Yahoo Sports Fantasy on a different platform. How does that work from a sort of API? I know Yahoo Sports has an open sort of philosophy, but most of the other fantasy companies don't.
I don't have any good answers. I mean, they're still fairly closed, and the integration is still sort of non-commercial in terms of what they allow other companies to do with their data. And so right now, they're pretty much walled gardens that you have to work within their environment, and you can't really do anything outside of it.
All right, we have time for one last question.
Hey, Robbie.
Tom.
Question on what you guys are doing with Yahoo. It's obviously technically impressive on the back end, but I'm curious, it seems like the limiting factor for creating exciting content is whatever data they make available to you via their API. And I'm curious if you guys have had to do anything post getting data from them where you had to create your own sort of value-added stats or build up your own data warehouse of the Yahoo data that you had to store on your end throughout the season to get, the exciting types of raw data that you guys felt you needed to create more exciting editorial content, or if you're just taking every week, you just take what you get from them and spit it out and nothing is stored.
No, we keep essentially every box score of every fantasy matchup throughout the year, and so whenever we go to process a Week 10 recap, it will actually include all the previous 9 weeks totals, and we'll do all of our computations there to figure out, what are the rankings and the streaks and the records and all of that stuff in real time. So we do have to keep that historical copies around just so we can do that kind of analysis.
All right, let's give a warm round of applause for Robbie.